Welcome, everybody, to our Building Power to Shape a Climate Equitable City, Caring City series. We're very excited to be together this evening to complete workshop number one, which is all about an introduction to city planning. So, um, we're going to do a lot of learning together this evening and getting to know each other a lot better. And it's really important for us in this workshop, especially, but in all the work that we do, to start our time together in a good way. And part of that means taking time to acknowledge that we are standing or sitting, living and working on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And we are recognizing through this acknowledgement that the work of decolonization is ongoing and important for each and every one of us in our daily lives. This is especially important for us to ground ourselves in as we start an evening of learning on city planning and thinking about the ways in which the land is used and the ways in which we exist in this space, in this place, in this time, and into the future. Really important for us to be holding the histories and the truths and the futures of this land in our conversations for the evening. And we also want to celebrate that it is Black History Month and are hoping that you've all had opportunities to celebrate Black history and Black excellence, and also to do some connection and some learning, whether that's in your own neighborhoods or with some of the amazing community groups and people who are in our city, making the city a better place to live. So, want to bring that into our space this evening as well. And would love to transition to having some members from the City for All Women initiative and the Ecology Ottawa team to introduce themselves and introduce the project that brings us all here for the day.
Thank you, Amanda and Georgette, and good evening, everybody. We're so thrilled to have everybody here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kata. I am the Communications and Civic Engagement Coordinator at CAWI.
Hi, everyone. I am William Van Geest. Are you able to see me? I see Kata. Okay, good. Yeah, I am Executive Director with Ecology Ottawa. Ecology Ottawa, we are a local grassroots organization that is seeking to make Ottawa the green capital of Canada. We focus on the City of Ottawa, as you might have guessed, and we have a variety of programs related to climate and climate change and nature and biodiversity and people and how to mobilize folks with the type of environmental action that they want to take. So yeah, we're pleased to be working with CAWI on this program that just in its very design is a really nice intersection of both of our mandates. From our end, working on climate issues, particularly the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and thereby avoiding the worst of climate change, but also adaptation to the reality of climate change that we know is on the way and is already with us to some extent. Of course, CAWI on all the myriad equity issues that are related. So I'm joined here this evening by my colleague Nick Grover, who is our climate change organizer. And we will be surfacing at various points of the presentation. So glad that everyone is here with us this evening.
Thank you so much. And Georgette and I would also like to take a moment to introduce ourselves. We are both part of the City for All Women Initiatives Facilitator Network. So my name is Amanda Palmer. Pronouns are she, her. My background is in community development and facilitation, community engagement, and I'm super excited to be diving in on city planning with you all this evening.
Yes, and my name is Georgette Morris. As Amanda's mentioned, I'm also part of the Facilitators Network. My background's in labor relations, policy, and equity, diversity, inclusion, and very excited for today's session.
We do want to give everybody a chance to introduce yourselves as well. But first, we'll give you a broad overview of what you can expect over the next 3 hours. And then we will do some introductions before diving into understanding the planning ecosystem. So our major agenda points of the evening are going to be understanding the planning ecosystem, and we'll cover what that looks like in terms of legislation, policy, people. Then we're going to take about a 10-minute care break because we know that being on our screens can be very draining and it's important for us to move our bodies. And then when we come back from our break, we're going to be diving in a little bit deeper on Ottawa's zoning bylaw before talking a lot more about development applications, what they are, what that process looks like, and how we might get involved in that process, and then bringing ourselves to a close for the evening. So in a moment, Kata is going to open up some breakout rooms for us. And you're going to have about 8 minutes in your breakouts. You're going to be in groups of three. I know some of you have mentioned that you're duos at your devices, and I know some of you aren't able to use your microphones. So we'll just try to encourage people to find out what each other's technological situations are. And if you need to use the chat to communicate, that is absolutely welcome. We're multimodal here. But what we love you to do is just to take a moment and introduce yourselves, share your name, your pronouns, and what brings you here today. What are you hoping to leave with from this whole workshop series? And maybe if you're inspired, what does a climate equitable city mean to you? We'll throw those prompts into the chat so that you have them with you in the breakout rooms that you get pulled into. And Kata, you are free to open those up whenever you are ready. So we'll do quick introductions and then we'll be back together. We hope that that was a lovely time getting to meet some of your co-learners. Would love to hear from just a couple of people what came up, what were some of the things that brought people here or hopes people had to leave. Would especially love to hear if there were some common answers that were coming up. Feel free to,
I'll,
yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
there were, we discussed issues with the LRT and bike lanes, and the concern over the heat waves now that we're seeing in the summer and how that's adversely affecting people, particularly low-income people.
Great. Thank you.
And we want to get more engaged with the city process, and maybe we can, you know, come together and push for better policy.
Beautiful. Great. Thank you. Afua in the chat says a common answer, interested in learning more about making the city more equitable. Definitely an important task. I'm excited to be on that journey with you all. Is there one more person who wants to share something that came up from your group? No? Okay. Well, hopefully that's not because people don't have ideas. I'm sure you all have had a lot to say in your conversations. Um, and we are hopefully going to be able to, together, both tonight and across the next 4 sessions, be able to dive in a lot more into how we make the city more equitable, what engagement can look like, and build our skills around engagement, and also those broader goals of how do we design and develop the city in a way that meets our needs, not only now, but into the future, factoring in the different changes that we are already experiencing, like heat waves or conversely cold snaps and the like. So what we thought would be important groundwork for us to start with in this journey is to have a common understanding of planning and the planning landscape so that we can then be applying an equity lens onto and into that work and into the engagements that we want to do together. So to get us started, it's probably important that we have a common understanding around what is planning. So does anybody have an idea of how we might define planning? And feel free to just unmute and share or raise a hand or throw your answer in the chat.
Hi. Could you please define what you mean by climate equity?
Yes. I think William spoke to it a little bit. Nick, do you want to share?
Yeah, I'd be happy to throw an answer in the chat, just so it can live there and everyone can see it, if that works for everybody.
Great.
Sounds good,
Thank you.
thanks.
So, I mean, broadly speaking, when we're talking about climate equity, I think we're looking at understanding the impacts of climate change and what that means not only now, but into the future, and how are we um, factoring in through both mitigation, which is the ways that we can try to limit climate change and its impacts moving forward, and also adaptation, which speaks to more of the how we adjust our behaviors, adjust our infrastructure to recognize the impacts that are already being felt or will be felt in the future. So really trying to take all that into consideration and then recognize the differing impacts that different groups will feel or experience through climate equity. But Nick is going to provide a more thorough definition for us in the chat. So thank you, Nick, for that. But for today's, I mean, we'll be speaking a little bit more about climate equity and climate impacts at the next session. Today, we're going to go deep in city planning. So I would love to hear from people. Does anybody have an idea of what city planning is or what planning would be defined as?
I can talk about just general planning, and I think one can always use that to extrapolate on what the city would be doing in the different areas. Planning, I know, is you looking ahead and looking at your resources and having a goal as to what you would do with them to meet your desired goals. Or yeah, like you want to look at where you are presently and where you want to be in future, and you want to use the resources you have now to achieve what you're hoping to get in the future. That's as basic I think I can come up with.
Yes, that's a fantastic definition. Very well said. Thank you. And so I appreciate that framing because an official definition that the City of Ottawa has used, which is not so clearly articulated, is the City of Ottawa defines land use planning, which is the type of planning we're talking about. Yewande just spoke to planning more broadly, and this is really looking at land use, so narrowing the frame of it, as the planning of the scientific, aesthetic, and orderly disposition of the land, resources, facilities, and services with a view to securing physical, environmental, economic, and social efficiency, health, and well-being. Just a lot of words, but that kind of back half speaks to the goals that Yewande was speaking to. So how are we going to use the land into the future, taking into consideration key pieces like the science needs, aesthetic, beauty, how it looks, how we manage the resources, the buildings, the ways in which we engage in services or connections in that place, and then with a broad set of goals around these like intersections of environmental and economic needs, but also our social needs, especially when we think of that caring cities lens of the ways in which our city grows and evolves and is meeting the needs of everybody. So that's broadly what planning is. And as we can imagine, it covers a lot of different things and really is an essential way in which our day-to-day lives are affected through these planning mechanisms. And so another important thing for us to be aware of as we move into digging in more on planning is who has a role in planning. And would love to hear from a few different people of who you think some of the key actors in the planning ecosystem might be.
Developers?
Sure, developers. Who else has a role in planning?
City councilors?
Yeah. Jean says architects. Sure, yeah.
Settlers?
Settlers, absolutely. Okay.
Engineers?
Yeah. Great answers so far. You all have gotten extremely specific, which is great. Landscape architects, absolutely, Carol. So when we think about broadly speaking within the planning ecosystem, there are a number of key people who have a role or key institutions. Many of the examples that we just came up with are captured within the people portion. So the people portion includes everyday folks like ourselves who are able to inform the process based on who we elect, based on the conversations that we're having with our officials, based on the ways in which we engage, and we'll be learning more about that. But also through things like developers who are putting through projects, architects who are helping design it, engineers, all of that is absolutely true. They all have a role to play. And those roles may also be influenced in these other areas. But at a higher level, the City of Ottawa has a really significant role in planning. I think it was Michelle who mentioned city councilors. The city council and the mayor have a big influence on city planning, as do the people who work for the city and administration, including people in the planning department, including the engineers who we can work in many different departments that help actually build our city. So City of Ottawa is absolutely a key player. They are not the only player, though, when it comes to policy development. The province of Ontario is another key player by setting out legislation. And they also have several agencies that inform what can and cannot be done in on certain land. Indigenous rights holders, which on these lands are the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, do have an important role to play that is not typically recognized to the degree that it should be, given that they are the rights holders, but it was important for us to still name them. And then the Government of Canada also has an important role to play. Typically, that role exists anywhere in the country through key policy oversight decisions around things like immigration policy or like fisheries policy, which can then have like implications on developments, especially near waterways. However, given that we are in Ottawa, which is the nation's capital, the federal government plays a unique role here where in the National Capital Region, 11% of the land is owned by the federal government and so operated by the National Capital Commission, otherwise known as the NCC. And so we will sometimes in our city see planning initiatives that are quite different. And so on one side of the road, it might actually be federal land that's governed by the NCC, and they might be doing a pilot project, say, closing down a street for active transportation that wouldn't happen elsewhere in the city. And that can be because it's different jurisdiction, which isn't felt the same way in other municipalities across the country. We are focusing more in this course or this workshop series, on the City of Ottawa and the land in which they have jurisdiction. Although sometimes there is that overlap, but it felt important for us to share that the Government of Canada does play an important role. And while that can make some things a little bit more challenging because you have even more players involved, in some ways it can also be an opportunity because one level of government might try something really interesting and unique, and then the other can try that in a different neighborhood or different area, and vice versa. So it can create some inspiration, although often it creates complication, especially for citizens who don't necessarily recognize the difference between this side of the road and that side of the road. But it felt important to name as we look at the overall landscape. So now that we have a broad sense of the various players, it's really important for us to get an understanding of the legislation and the policy directives that govern planning and how that land is planned in our city, so that we can better then understand who we need to talk to about what and how we might engage in that process to influence change. So this graphic here gives a good overview of the layers of that, and we're going to go over each piece individually. So don't stress too much about this. But as we can see here, this purple area underneath, the Ontario Planning Act is the overarching legislation that all planning decisions must align with. And there's also the provincial policy statement that must inform what the city does in terms of planning. Then we have the City of Ottawa official plan here in the blue, with secondary plans, community design plans, master plans, all falling within that. And then at the core is the municipal or City of Ottawa zoning bylaw, which is how all of these plans and policies are implemented and legally enforceable, is through the zoning bylaw. We're going to be digging in on that more deeply today as well. So if we go back up to that provincial level, we have the Ontario Planning Act, and it is the legal document of how all planning must be done, not only in the City of Ottawa, but in all across Ontario. And about every 4 years, the most recent one being in 2024, the province will put out a new provincial policy statement, which is a legal document that gives policy direction to all municipalities of how planning should unfold. And so that can offer a little bit of commonality across the experience around the province, and is important for things like ensuring that planning is fair everywhere, ensuring that there's clear expectations on when the public is included and notified about how they can be engaged in different development processes, and different things like that. And it provides clear guidance on different policy directives. So for instance, one of the significant pieces in our provincial policy statement right now is this notion of transit-oriented development, which is this priority of protecting wetlands and farmland by developing high-rise towers in locations that are accessible by transit. So really looking at trying to, as we add more housing, doing it in areas where there's not already existing housing, but it's close to transit. And we'll be unpacking this more over the course of not only this evening, but the next few sessions. But it's important for us to know that there's a planning act, a provincial planning act that must be followed, and then provincial policy directives that also must be followed, and that includes engagement directives. So for instance, one of the changes in this new policy directive, it used to be that even small rise buildings, if a developer wanted to add a small rise or low rise building in a neighborhood, community would get notified and have an opportunity to have a say on that process. But the provincial policy statement changes it to, I think it has to be more than 10 stories or something like this now, before the community gets notified. And so even if we wanted to do more, the provincial government is what's setting that standard to a certain point that can really affect things. So again, important for us to know, main message here is that the province has a big role to play in planning decisions. And while we might be thinking just about the people who are here in our city, sometimes there's some work to be done at the provincial level as well, to create the city we want. At the municipal level, this is where it gets a lot meatier for us. So we have, the city takes the provincial policy statement and uses that to help inform an official plan that is a legally binding document that sets the goals and direction for how the City of Ottawa will be planned. And when we create the official plan, it takes into consideration that future population growth and things like transportation, service needs, where will people live, where will they work, where will they have their recreation time, and how are they going to get from all of these places. So the official plan is a really important document that tells us how the city intends to grow and how the city envisions the future and gives us clear directives of what needs to be followed. And to support that plan, there are what are called secondary plans, and those provide slightly more detailed policies that get more to a neighborhood level, because as I'm sure we can imagine, how we apply those policy pieces to an inner city old neighborhood that's quite built up will look and feel very different to a newer, more suburban neighborhood that doesn't have that same level of development, and so different considerations. So secondary plans allow us to get more specific into neighborhood character and are still factoring in all those pieces, but the official plan policies are kind of more blanket across the city, and these you can start to understand what that looks like more in practice at more specific levels. In support of the official plan are also a number of what are called master plans. And these are not legally binding, but they're still quite important. Those include things like our transportation plan or water and wastewater infrastructure or the 10-year housing and homelessness plan, which all provide further policy guidance in those realms and effectively act as the capital spending plans. So they again are getting much more specific of if our official plan is saying we want to grow in this way, that's what it's going to mean when it comes to our transportation needs. And then the city can use that information to allocate budget needs and what kind of development, capital development is going to be needed from that. Our official plan is still called the new official plan, though it's a couple of years old at this point, and it lays out 5 big moves or big policy directions that are really guiding what the growth in our city looks like or will look like between now and about like 2050. And so those are framed as growth management, mobility, urban and community design, climate, energy, and public health, and economic development. And so those are the lens through which many of the decisions are being made in terms of how our city is developed in the coming years. And there were a few pieces that we wanted to pull out more specifically to bring in that climate lens. So within the growth management policy directive in the official plan, it notes that we will achieve by the end of the planning period, so again, kind of like 2046, 2050, more growth by intensification than by greenfield development. And within that, an increase in the variety of affordable low-rise housing options for residents within existing neighborhoods close to hubs and corridors. Increase the urban tree canopy and promote an evolution to 15-minute neighborhoods. So again, we can see there that transit-oriented development notion. We want to increase the number of people who are living in existing neighborhoods, and this idea of 15-minute neighborhoods being a really consistent policy directive guiding a lot of the development in our city. And we'll be diving more into that today. When it comes to mobility, it talks about by 2046, the majority of trips in the city will be made by sustainable transportation. So again, really looking at how are we building our city in a ways in which more people can be walking, cycling, taking transit, or carpooling to the destinations that they need. And for the climate, energy, and public health growth area, it talks about embedding environmental, climate, and health resiliency and energy into the framework of our planning policies. So again, looking at in our neighborhoods, having a diverse mix of land uses. So not just all homes, but including houses, shopping, services, access to local and healthy, affordable food, mature trees, green spaces, all of these things are meant to be within our neighborhoods, and that's how we're evolving. And it also includes policies to help the city achieve its target of 100% greenhouse gas emissions reduction by 2050 and a target of 40% urban forest canopy cover, which is quite significant, all in the interest of increasing the city's resiliency to the effects of climate change. So again, this is what our official plan says should be followed when we're looking at any new developments, how we're allocating our resources in the city. I also wanted to note, so on the graphic on the left-hand side here, that talks about kind of pulls out some of the key features of the new official plan, certainly like density, things like that that we've talked about. Here it says population growth. So this is from a presentation a couple months ago now, and at the time it was expected, the population was expected to grow over 400,000 people by 2046. But a report just got released late last week for an upcoming committee meeting next week. And it noted that the population says that Ottawa's population is to grow by 530,000 residents between 2024 and 2051, and the number of households growing from 433,000 to nearly 700,000. So we get these plans every few years, and then we're still getting new information and adjusting accordingly. So at the time, we were working under the assumption of about 400,000 new people in that time period, and the updated number is actually saying 530,000 more people. So what was already an ambitious plan to add a lot of new housing and a lot of intensification will need to be further, we'll need to factor in an entire, that's like what, a 25% increase to the population than what had even been anticipated in what we are going over today. And I see a smile on Georgette's face of how we're going to navigate that. But bring that up to say that's like breaking news. I saw that in a news article earlier today, and important for us to continue to think about in our conversations today of like, what does intensification mean and how do we have a city that follows all of these policy directives that are listed here around sustainable transportation and those sorts of things, while also meeting these housing needs. Yes, Yewande.
Yes, please. I couldn't understand. Are we saying that the projection, are we behind or we have exceeded or we're not gonna, I mean, like, I didn't understand the statistics.
Yeah, so it's not a measurement of our success. It's at the time that the official plan was written, they thought that there would be 400,000 more people living in the city by 2050. So that was their projection. The projection was 400,000 in that 25-ish year period. But a new update that just is coming in is saying that it's actually going to be 530,000 more residents.
Oh,
So it's that population projection that is just being announced is shifting and saying there's actually going to be a lot more people living in Ottawa by 2050 than previously anticipated.
okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question. It's a great one. Okay, so that is high level what our municipal planning legislation and policy is. Our official plan, again, is a legal document, and these policy directives should be guiding every decision that gets made. And we do that through the zoning bylaw. So this is a legal tool that just kind of enacts all of these policies, and it does so by actually designating land in certain ways and limiting what can be built where and how. We're going to get a lot more into the zoning bylaw in a little bit, but that is kind of what we wanted to leave you with at this point of just understanding we've got all these policies and we implement them through the zoning bylaw. And the zoning bylaw is also brand new. It was just passed on Wednesday, January 28th, so not quite 2 weeks ago. The City Council passed a new zoning bylaw that was the result of multiple years of community engagement efforts to develop a new zoning bylaw that reflects and allows us to enact our new official plan. So we're seeing some shifts in what that looks like, and we'll be going over that in our time together today to understand how, again, what our plans are for the city in the next couple of decades and how we can get involved in that process. We know we've just given a ton of information though. So what we'd like to do is to give you a chance to digest it all and start to think about like, what does this actually mean in practice? And the lens that we want to offer you to help with that is the 15-minute neighborhoods. So this is something that is throughout the official plan and is a key policy approach that will help us to achieve a lot of the goals that are laid out in that official plan. And I pulled this definition from the official plans definition section. And much like the planning definition, it's a little hard to make sense of. Ecology Ottawa has a definition that I think is a little bit more accessible. So how Ecology Ottawa describes a 15-minute neighborhood as a community or communities where most of our daily necessities and services such as work, food, shopping, education, healthcare, and leisure can be easily reached within a 15-minute walk or even less via rolling, biking, or public transit. So essentially, they are neighborhoods that are designed in a way in which we can meet many of our different needs to kind of live our full lives in a way that can be done in short distances from where we live. So what we're going to invite you to do is Kata is going to be opening up breakout rooms. You should be in groups of about 4. And we would love for you to spend a little bit of time talking amongst yourselves around what does a caring 15-minute neighborhood look like in practice? If you imagine your own neighborhood and take into consideration what a 15-minute neighborhood is supposed to be, like what would that actually look like or feel like? How might the official plan policy directives that we talked about actually be enacted if that was the case? So thinking through these pieces around sustainable transportation, intensification, all of that. The invitation is to imagine that together and come up with some ideas of what it would actually look like in practice. And then we'll come back together and we'll hear what people came up with. Beautiful. Welcome back, everyone. That time goes by so quickly, I know. We'd love to open it up to the group and spend a few minutes just hearing from each group a couple of the ideas or topics that came up for you when you thought together about what a caring 15-minute neighborhood might look like in practice. Do we have a volunteer, one of the 3 groups that wants to go first? Nick, I see your hand is up.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, we had a good discussion, and as we were trying to, envision what these neighborhoods might look like, it became clear that it's hard to do. It's hard to do when so much of Ottawa, you need a car to get around, and it kind of defies reality to think that anything could be closer. And so I shared my experience because I'm very lucky. I'm a very lucky guy. I live in Sandy Hill, and I have a grocery store, a hairdresser, a medical clinic within about 1 minute from my house. And then within 5 minutes, there's, chiropractor, more services, movie theater. And then 10 minutes is a major transit station and a mall. And so this stuff is definitely possible. But I of course live in an area where there's lots of people to sustain this stuff. It's been well planned. It's in the older core of the city, so this is how cities used to be built, and that persists. So I just wanted to share that experience that there is a real neighborhood in the city that looks like this to just help us envision what's possible in others.
Great, thank you. Does another group want to share? Yeah, Michelle.
Um, yeah, I guess most of us felt that in Centertown that we are very privileged that we a lot of our services are nearby. Although there was mention of a neighborhood in Vanier where there are no sidewalks and children and people are forced to walk on roads, which is very dangerous. Yeah. But also people, even in Centertown, people with disabilities are not able to get out in the wintertime. And that's very unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely. Great, thank you. How about from our third group? What were some of the pieces that came out for you when you thought about what a caring 15-minute neighborhood would look like in practice? I think that was the group with Afua, Carol, John, Tristan, and Neha.
Yes, we mostly discussed about our neighborhoods where we all live, and we compared a bit in terms of public transit, things like that. And for example, there were multiple people from Centertown area, and they said that's nice indeed to have the shops and everything, but it's quite expensive, those shops. So if you want to go to somewhere cheaper, it adds up like walking. There was someone who was living in Bayshore as well who loved her neighborhood and who could walk around. That's what we say, I think.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing. Apologies if you can hear my cat screeching in the background. She's got very vocal. So I was hearing a lot of common threads around importance of transportation, mobility, actually being able to move from place to place coming up a lot when we were thinking about that 15-minute neighborhood. It's being really essential. And then also that note of it's great to have many things near us, but they also need to be affordable as well. So kind of factoring in that those goods and services need to be varied in their offerings. Um, some other pieces that we wanted to bring up, and Michelle's group, we spoke about this a little bit, but one of the things that the official plan states is that the winter maintenance standards shall support the priority of active transportation networks and the achievement of active transportation mode share targets set out in the transit plan. Um, so that notion that you spoke of like accessibility in the winter being a barrier, that is in our plan in terms of winter maintenance, that we need to be increasing what that looks like to allow for our sidewalks to be usable in the winter, for instance, or our bike transportation being used in the winter. Whether we're seeing that in practice right now is a different question, but certainly an important consideration for us as well. I think one of the things that is really important for me, so I live in Mechanicsville, so also more inner city, as many of the examples shared so far. I live right across from a park, and so access to green space is another really important thing for us to be thinking about when we're thinking about 15-minute cities, and not just green space, but also trees, mature trees. So how are we ensuring that as we continue to develop our neighborhoods, we're ensuring that there's still green space that's being kept in those spaces, that we're replacing trees that are being lost and adding new trees. All of that's a really important part of making a complete neighborhood as well. And transit, another really common thread, not only for us to be able to move around within those 15 minutes in our neighborhoods, but also to be able to see our friends, family, colleagues, etc., in different parts of the city. So ensuring that the street networks that we're creating are capable of accommodating transit routes. And we're planning in the future, especially as we look to add many, many more people, that we're really investing a lot in transit infrastructure to accommodate that. And not just transit, but also that active transportation as well. So that combination of transit and transit nodes like our LRT stations and increasing that, but also looking at bike infrastructure and the like. And all of this is really important for us to think about in the context of climate equity, because not only are 15-minute neighborhoods valuable for us to live our more fulsome lives, and it's really great to be able to get to what we want, but transportation and buildings are 90% of the city's total greenhouse gas emissions. So if we are wanting to help mitigate climate change in the future, a really big thing we can do is to focus on developing in a way that allows for our transportation network to be much more resilient and much more in the active transportation side, making sure we're clearing pathways in the winter so that we can be walking and biking and the like in the winter, and using our transportation system, which will not always be as challenging as it is in winter of 2026. Any last thoughts people had in working through that exercise on the 15-minute neighborhoods? Okay, well, we are going to move then into a 10-minute break. We know we've been here for quite some time now, so give your bodies a chance to move, give your eyes a break from the screens, hydrate, hydrate, hydrate. Do whatever it is you need to do to care for yourselves. And when we come back together, we're going to dive a little bit more into zoning bylaw and then development applications. So we'll see you all in about 10 minutes. Hopefully that was a good break. Hopefully you're feeling energized and ready for the second half of our time together. We are going to talk a little bit more about the zoning bylaw before diving into development applications, and what that looks like and means for us and our engagement possibilities. And a tool that Georgette and I have found really helpful for illustrating the impacts of planning decisions and zoning bylaw is this quick little video that I'm going to try to play. Georgette, will you signal to me if you can hear okay, perfect, thank you.
Yep.
These are both suburban neighborhoods built right next to each other, but they couldn't be more different. To show you what I mean, let's try getting pizza, and we'll start with this neighborhood. Right away, you'll notice the continuous tree-lined sidewalks that make it an inviting place for people to walk. This is because vehicle access to these homes happens from alleys placed behind the houses. Because of this, the actual street doesn't need a driveway for each house's garage, allowing the street to focus on people. In fact, some front porches open up to a lawn instead. With a focus on public green space, it allows for trails that create shortcuts for people walking around the neighborhood too. Finally, and most importantly, you'll notice that this neighborhood actually has businesses in it too, not just houses. Part of the reason this works is because there are different types of housing in this neighborhood, like townhouses, duplexes, and traditional single-family homes. This mix provides a level of density that allows for enough people to be within walking distance of these businesses, one of which is a pizza place, and they're all placed right on the street, creating a sense of place rather than just plopped into a parking lot. And for the people who do want to drive to it, they still have parking placed behind the building. This entire journey was safe and comfortable to walk, and also provided opportunities to naturally interact with your neighbors, whether that's waving hi to people sitting on their porches or walking through the park. Now let's try getting pizza in this neighborhood. First off, there aren't any pizza places, just houses, which means we'll have to find one in a nearby suburban shopping center. There's a Domino's not too far, but the infrastructure to walk doesn't exist. There are no sidewalks, and there's even signs at the intersection leaving the neighborhood telling you not to walk. So instead, we'll have to drive. You'll notice this neighborhood has driveways that cut into the sidewalk for every house. And instead of encountering people sitting on the front porch, you just encounter other cars sitting in driveways. After we exit the neighborhood, we have to drive on this huge suburban road before turning across 4 lanes of traffic to finally get into this shopping center with the Domino's. Some of the other businesses here do have outdoor seating, but they all just face the parking lot. While this is the typical suburban experience around the country, it doesn't have to be. It's possible to build quaint, walkable neighborhoods even in the suburbs.
So that video does a really great job at showing how different planning decisions can have radically different experiences for people. I believe this is in Pennsylvania, so 2 neighborhoods close together. One that is much closer to that 15-minute city neighborhood model gives a much different, more pleasant experience, I would say, than the other. And a lot of this comes down to or gets enacted through what is called the zoning bylaw. And that bylaw tells us what can be built, where, and how. Oops, we're just gonna go to the next slide if it'll let us. Maybe if I do it this way. So in our new zoning bylaw, there are many different designations for what land can be used for. We have things like transportation zones or recreation zones. There's this yellow to orange section here that are all formerly known as residential zones, now called neighborhood zones. So this tends to be where housing gets concentrated. And this, you don't need to know all of these today, but this kind of helps show you the many different ways that our land gets actually designated. And in practice, this is what the map looks like. So this area is the area around where the City for All Women Initiative's offices are at the Rideau Community Hub. And that's that blue building in the center here. It's a former high school, so it's institutional. And the point of this view for you is to show you that all of the land in the area gets color coded in this way, designated. And these different designations inform how high buildings can be in that, what type of buildings. It tells, like, as granular as like a daycare can go here, but it can't go there. And we really wanted to point out a few of these different categories that are more valuable for us to know for the conversation today. So these neighborhood zones being N1 to N6, these, again, yellow, light orange colors, that's where we have a lot of our homes. And the lower numbers and lighter colors are where we get much more smaller lots. We're looking at what used to be just single family homes. The new zoning bylaw allows us to have up to 4 units on a lot. Before, it could only be a single family home on a lot. But then as we get to the N5, N6, that's where you can start to see mid to high rises in those residential zones. And in addition to housing, we can also see daycares and schools permitted in those areas. And in those higher density N5, N6, you can see some other types of services like banks or community centers, artist studios, stores, things like that can exist there as well. My mouse is having a moment, but here we go. In this red zone is what is called a hub zone. And we've talked about hubs and corridors a little bit. We've talked about transit-oriented development, and it's these red hub zones where we are planning to have, according to the zoning bylaw, that's where we want to see high density, broad range of uses, and that's in close proximity to transit stations. We have Steerville Transit Station down here, for instance, University of Ottawa Lees. So like you can see, this is where a lot of our LRT is, and we are looking to have a lot of housing, high density in these zones, and that's what's allowed to go there. The purple areas, this is Saint Laurent here, and this is Montreal Road up here. Those are what are called Main Street corridor zones. There are different kinds of Main Street corridor zones, but it's essentially what we are looking to allow in those spaces are mixed use, pedestrian oriented. So we want to have a lot of shops, businesses, different types of offerings in those areas. And we want to have what they call continuous active street walls, which basically means that like as we're walking past, that there aren't any gaps, that there's kind of continuous things for us to experience along that area. Um, and what I can show you, because we're on our computer here, is there's a really handy website that allows you to see the map, and we'll put the link in the chat for you so you can play around with this on your own time. But this website lets you see the new zoning bylaw in action, and it also lets you see this is the view of the old zoning bylaw, and this is the view of the new zoning bylaw. I thought that might be helpful for us to see a little bit so we can see how some of the designations have changed. So you can see, for instance, that these like green areas have been converted into like recreation zones. We're seeing a shift here of where we're seeing more density down in this area. Again, those are like those hub corridor zones. But now that the new official bylaw is here, this is the view that we're really looking at of this is how the land is designated. You can search any address in here and get a sense of what does your neighborhood actually look like. And it gets quite specific. You can get down to you're seeing like the actual buildings in here, which is pretty important. And this matters for a number of reasons, not least of which is the designation determines how high a building can be or how far it has to be from the road, how much shade there needs to be. And people can apply to have that zoning designated changed if they want to build something different there, but it requires like that kind of lengthens the process. So it's important for us to be able to know how a particular area is zoned so we can understand what the city's intentions are for it. And then we can start to figure out like how do we advocate for something different, or as we see applications coming in that want to change how this is zoned into something else, helping us understand, well, does this align with the official plan and the policies that we want to use to grow, or our own vision of like 15-minute cities isn't enough, or as we spoke about in the last exercise, there was a lot on like transportation, transit, and that sort of thing. So looking at, okay, well, we're looking at a lot of high density in these areas. Do we actually have sufficient transit resources allocated to accommodate that, and getting really clear on what those needs might be. So to go back to our presentation, if I hit present, is that full screen again for you?
Yep.
Thanks, Georgette. So we've talked about a few different terms. We're going to go over a couple of definitions and really talk a bit more on the importance of zoning bylaw and how that works in conjunction with other things. So intensification is a term I'm sure you've all heard many times. You've probably used it too, and it's come up in different ways in our conversation so far this evening. And it's really looking at concentrating housing development in certain areas, typically areas that are already developed to some degree, as opposed to increasing on what's called greenfield. And we do that through new height allowances that make it possible for more housing to go on existing land. So creation of new units, development of vacant or underutilized units, so that conversion of parking lots into housing, for instance, or the expansion conversion of existing buildings. Sometimes what we're seeing in some urban centers now is, and also in Ottawa, we're seeing some office buildings being converted into housing. And I think that there's a few projects of buildings that are owned by the federal government that are being converted, for instance, into housing. So intensification can take many forms, but it's really about how we're adding more, and not just housing, but typically housing on existing land through various means. And actually on the intensification front, when Ottawa the City of Ottawa announced the official passing of its new zoning bylaw on January 28th. Part of the messaging that was shared with that announcement was that it is the most housing-friendly zoning bylaw in the city's history. That's really how the City of Ottawa is trying to speak to the changes made to the zoning bylaw. And they also, in that announcement, talked about how that is possible in conjunction with something called Ottawa's Housing Acceleration Plan, which is a plan that was approved last fall that has 53 different actions to address the housing challenge. So we have our zoning bylaw that creates different conditions that allow us to build more easily. For instance, in the old zoning bylaw, there were mandatory parking spaces that were based on ratios. So it'd be like for X number of units, you need to have X percentage of parking spaces. And that was just mandatory. So what a lot of developers were having to do as transit developed over the 20 plus years and people weren't needing as many parking spaces, is they were having to go through a development application process to say, like, actually, we don't need that much parking because people can use XYZ methods. And that was making it more costly and expensive. Or conversely, they were having to include the parking requirements in their plans, which meant spending some of that precious land on parking spaces or investing in underground parking, which is a very, very, very expensive part. So it's making projects much more expensive. So one of the shifts in the new zoning bylaw as part of trying to support intensification is the removal of parking minimums. So that's no longer a mandatory ratio, which doesn't mean parking is not going to be considered. Of course it is, but without it being that mandatory ratio, it allows for projects to not have to make applications for changes based on that alone. And so with the Ottawa's Housing Acceleration Plan, in conjunction with the zoning bylaw, it's meant to support things like proactively designing it and doing site preparation on city lands to support affordable housing development, or supporting the growth and capacity of nonprofit housing providers to intensify existing sites, or proactively undertaking site preparation of public lands along, again, those transit hubs and major corridors. So the city's really trying to prioritize those areas, has made changes in the zoning bylaw to accommodate that, and then also has this plan that will get considered by planners when projects come through of, does it align with these things, or what are the other mechanisms we can do to help housing get approved more easily. There's something else in the works right now called inclusionary zoning. And so this is, I believe it's a proposed bylaw. It's still being considered, and there's a discussion paper out right now for public comment. And I believe public comment is open until, maybe it closed yesterday or open until today. But it is this approach that is meant to be a tool that requires new residential developments to include affordable housing near major transit stations. So again, we already have that directive from the provincial policy statement trying to tell us transit-oriented development is important. That's reflected in the zoning bylaw as well and in our official plan. But this is a further tool that would further mechanize that and make affordable housing a bigger piece of what that looks like. But on the topic of affordable housing, it's really important for us to be mindful of what that means and how that might be different from what we think it means. So if you look again at the official plan's definition section, when they talk about affordable housing, they have definitions for market affordable and core affordable. I'm not going to read out verbatim what's said there, but essentially how they determine what is affordable housing, it's based on income percentiles. So people who are in the 60th percentile or like top 60%, what have you, that the cost of housing is about 30% of their income. And then core affordable is looking at a lower, people whose average income is in the 30th percentile, so not making as much as other people, that again, it's at that kind of like 30% or less gross income going towards housing. So that is how the official definition of affordable gets captured, is both market affordable and core affordable. Our lived realities of what is affordable is not necessarily aligned with that. And certainly in our session that was in person last week, there was a conversation about like when we're talking about affordable, we're actually talking deeply affordable. It's actually much less of our income going towards this, or recognizing that many people whose income is under the 30th percentile are still really struggling. And what we're desperately looking for is housing that is even more affordable than what they're talking about when it comes to affordable housing. So part of why we wanted to bring this up is to speak to some of those other tools that get accompanied with the official plan, those secondary plans, master plans, zoning bylaw. All of these kind of work together to help guide decisions on what gets developed and what doesn't get developed. And also it's important for us to know that then as we're advocating for what we would like to see, to understand all those different mechanisms and to be able to challenge some of these different pieces more specifically. Affordable housing is something that the CAWI community certainly advocates a lot, especially from the deep affordability lens. But are there some other important considerations that people want to name that we think should be top of mind for us to be advocating for when we're looking at new development applications that might be coming in? Yeah, Tristan and Neha say accessibility, absolutely. That came up in our earlier activity as well, but accessibility both in terms of mobility, but also in terms of the design of the actual buildings and homes themselves. Do they account for people who might use mobility aids, for instance? Are there other examples of things that we might want to consider? Yeah, absolutely. Is it in a flood zone? Especially important when we think about the anticipated effects of climate change over the coming years. Having higher rainfalls in shorter periods leading to more flood-prone environments. That's an important one.
I don't know if this counts, but for rent versus for purchase.
That's huge. That's really, really huge. Also part of that affordability conversation, like who rent is a big part of that. And like what we have seen is a lot of the housing that's been developed is condos. It's meant for people who are purchasing, not actually for renters. So that's a great one. Thank you. I see Carol added in here, families, so many homes in urban centers downtown are one-bedroom units. That's another huge one of what are the actual capacities and who are these being designed for? That's a great one. Michelle, I saw your hand was up.
Yeah, an aging population.
Yes. In the report that I was speaking to earlier that Nick linked to the article about, they were also speaking to the aging population as a big factor. And our population of people 90 and over is set to double in that time, for instance. And a huge part of our population is going to be in that older cohort, not just 90 and above, but it's a really important one too, especially when we take in accessibility. Like, again, who are we designing these for? How are we ensuring that people can age in our city?
What about noise pollution for those who looking at the inclusionary zoning and we want to build near major transit stations? How do we, I mean, I think that should be something that should be considered.
Yes, absolutely. Noise pollution is really, really important. In my neighborhood in Mechanicsville, the LRT kind of goes right by many houses. And the community actually did have to do some advocacy work a few years ago to get noise dampening because when the train came in, it was really loud and affecting people's quality of life. So it's a really important one, making sure that we're designing that as we're expanding our transportation and also using building materials that are supporting that in our homes too. we're going to transition over to development application process now, but just a couple more ideas for us to think about might be things like urban canopy or tree cover. So we had mentioned that one of the targets is that we have 40% urban urban tree coverage by 2050. So making sure that we're really protecting mature trees, especially I can't remember who earlier in the evening from our first breakouts, people talked about the heat waves. So making sure that we have mature trees that are offering shade and helping reduce the heat island effect that happens in cities is another really important one. Or replacing trees that do get destroyed or when developments happen. Sustainable modes of travel and active transportation and transit, a common theme tonight, also something that we want to be factoring in when we're looking at what plans are coming in our cities, green space, amenities, all those types of things are things that we can be asking questions about and thinking about as we encounter development applications. But I'm going to turn the reins over to the incredible Georgette, who's going to walk us through the development application process and development applications more broadly now.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Amanda. I just want to check that folks can hear me okay.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, tonight we're going to be talking about some development applications. And so now that we know a little bit more about the planning ecosystem and how the zoning bylaw shapes how cities are developed, we're going to shift to understanding the development application process. So just a question for folks, what is a development application? You can say it out loud, or if you prefer to drop it in the chat, I'll give folks a sec to do that. But again, the question being, what is a development application? Okay, maybe okay, I'll give folks just another couple of seconds. So a development application, what is that all to do with? It is really when a developer must submit a development application to the city when they want to build something new or change the use of the land in Ottawa. Again, just going back to the slides where Amanda mentioned how different areas are zoned and what the use of the land must be. For example, when we looked at a CAWI being 815 St. Laurent, and that was formerly an institutional building, or is an institutional building, sorry. This process ensures that the proposed development aligns with the policies set out in the Province Planning Act, the city's official plan, and the zoning bylaw. This is reviewed by the City of Ottawa's Planning Services branch and the Committee of Adjustment. So those are the two main entities that the city has that you'll have to submit your application to. There are 3 types of projects that require development applications, and keeping in mind, the ones that are green are subject to public consultation. So first, we have a land use change, which would be a change in the setback. So maybe for, let's say, where your driveway is from the road. Height, parking used to be bigger, changing from residential to commercial. So an example that we can think about is land use change. And that is one of these examples that might be quite prominent in Ottawa is the Westgate Shopping Centre. Are folks familiar with Westgate Shopping Centre? It is also the first mall in Ottawa. Okay, so this mall has been torn down and is actually being redeveloped into 2 larger condos. There's a grocery store that will still be operative there. The Shoppers Drug Mart, I believe, will still be operative there, but that entire building and that frame is no longer going to be there. And again, just to be super clear, this is a land use change. Again, this is a change in setback, height, parking may have been bigger, and so forth. The second change is lot creation. So lot creations are applications to create new lots or ownership units, or in the case of a common elements condo, to create common elements that may not include the creation of any lots. So this might be a plan of subdivision, a plan of a condominium. A very popular or well-known example would be LeBreton Flats. So again, this is a mock-up drawing of what LeBreton Flats may look like in the future. In particular, at LeBreton Flats, there is a desire to have affordable housing. As chatted about earlier this evening, we're looking for deeply affordable housing. It's said to be about 900 new residents will be created, and there's a hope for 25% of those to be affordable. So again, this is LeBreton Flats, and this is a large undertaking with the City of Ottawa, as well as with its partner, the National Capital Commission, that will hope to utilize a community benefits analysis as this project develops. Again, this is a lot creation. And last but not least, we can think about lot development. So this is an application that includes what we've chatted about a little bit earlier today, but in order to proceed with the development on an existing lot that meets the standards of the zoning bylaw, that might be a street or lane opening or closing to create a community space. There might be a minimum required or maximum permitted. So at a very minimum, it might be that if you are, let's say, lessening a particular entryway, but at the very maximum, you cannot exceed doing that. And that's why you would submit a lot development application. This also can ring true as it relates to the height of a building, a structure on a property, a driveway width. For example, typically in single family dwellings, there is a desire to have 2 parkings. If you'd like to change that or amend that, this is the application that would be used. The example we have for a lot development is R4. Again, just thinking back to what Amanda chatted about earlier today, when we're looking at the different zones, an R4 is a residential 4. That's what the R4 stands for. And this is an example in Vanier, and this is an infill. So again, this is now a property that perhaps would have housed a single family dwelling beforehand, but now it is being built up to accommodate for 4 different units. So that's a R4 infill in Vanier. I'll pause here for just one quick moment. Are there any questions in terms of the 3 different applications? Okay. If there are any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we can definitely get them addressed. That being said, we're going to turn our attentions to the development application process. So does anyone have any experience with the development application in any way? I'm not seeing any hands, I don't think. Nope, no experience. Okay, no problem. So we're going to now do a little bit of an overview of the process. So the timelines may vary greatly depending on a number of factors, and that's why we don't necessarily offer a timeline with our presentation tonight. So the first step we can think about is pre-consultation. So this is not required, but is strongly encouraged to ensure that the developer is making informed decisions. Developers can discuss the proposal with city staff in the planning services and the Committee of Adjustment offices. And Ottawa, at this current time, does have a pilot with specific neighborhoods, which allows for pre-consultation meetings to occur with designated community representatives. So again, this is not always required, but it is strongly recommended. It's a pre-meet. Next, we have the application submission. All the required documents are filled out and submitted along with the fee. Online application is preferred. So within the application submission, there will be a number of documents that the developer would be submitting to the city. These documents can range from potential research that the developer has done to articulate why perhaps their development that they're proposing would be idea. They've done some studies perhaps, but is a significant amount of documents. And again, it's idea for this to be submitted online for tracking purposes, but that showcases that the developer has done some research, has facilitated perhaps some questions that the city may have had in the pre-consultation, but this is the application submission. That's part 2. Or I guess the second aspect of development applications. Next, we move on to circulation and notification. So any proposed project that are subject to public meetings are added to devapps.ottawa.ca. And the city staff circulate the application to the ward councillor, technical agencies, community associations and organizations, and public bodies. Many applications require notification via an on-site sign. That being said, the circulation notification is something that a ratepayer group such as CAWI and other organizations would receive. And this is, again, circulated by the City of Ottawa. And for folks who are interested, there's an opportunity for folks to sign up online, but that would be available on Dev Apps. And sorry, just for folks, the image on the right-hand side, this is just an example folks may see in their community of when there's a proposed development. Myself, I live in Centertown, and I see a number of these. And the other day I did see one, unfortunately, that the information was rubbed off. But from what I've come to understand, sometimes, I guess, with some type of snow clearing, but these signs are all over Ottawa, and it gives you a little bit of information in terms of what's being proposed and who to contact should you have questions. Moving on to step 4. We have community engagement. So the ward councillor can request that the city staff host an informal information session to hear the community input. So people can ask their councillor to do this. And in Ottawa, we often see community engagement opportunities called open houses. For significant changes, such as amendments to the official plan or the zoning bylaw, a public meeting is required, and it's known as a committee meeting, and it's advertised in local newspapers and communal places, sometimes in buildings in the city. Okay. Then we move on to a committee meeting, which the public can submit written feedback or attend in person and make a presentation. This type of application, the types of applications affects which committees that you may go to. So things like a minor variance or a consent to server go to the Committee of Adjustment, whereas official plan or zoning bylaw amendments have to go to the Planning and Housing or Agricultural and Rural Affairs Committee meetings. Okay. Again, I know it seems like there's a lot of steps, and there is. We move on to the council meeting, which this is where all the councillors in the City of Ottawa take in the information and make the final decision. The public cannot speak at this stage. So just to be clear, the public has an opportunity to speak and engage in the previous steps. But at the stage of the council meeting, the members of the city do not have an opportunity at that time for the public. So what happens now if, let's just say hypothetically, there's a development, the councillor did hold an engagement session, folks came out, had conversations, raised some really good points, yet it still moved ahead and it's still in progress and all things go, and the council have had their meeting and they have approved. There's an appeal or post approval. So if approved, the developer moves forward with the project, but if someone disagrees, they can appeal to the Ontario Land Tribunal. And the Ontario Land Tribunal is the responsibility of the province of Ontario. So I'll pause here. I know that's many steps. Are there any questions? I know it's a lot of information in terms of when you can get engaged, or if there's any more questions about the development application process. Okay. Not seeing any.
I have a question.
Yes.
There seems to be more security around a city council now. I used to do council watch with the Ecology Ottawa, and I noticed that there's it appears that there's more security and less public access. Is that correct?
It's interesting you say that. I did read something a couple of weeks ago, and it was around there was a higher security presence by City Hall. I think the rationale from what I remember reading was to deal with those who have a precarious housing circumstance. But I don't know. I'm not familiar if there's additional things as you enter City Hall that have been changed as of recent. But I have heard that there's more security around. Like, I live very close to City Hall, but I think when you're at certain entrances at certain times of the day, absolutely. But I'm not sure. I don't know if Amanda has any.
Yeah.
Yep.
So there was the surprise installation of security equipment at City Hall. So you used to be able to go in freely, and now you have to move through security apparatus, like a screener or what have you. And that wasn't publicly spoken about beforehand. It kind of just showed up. And some of the things that we heard from city councilors in response to this when community raised concerns of, like, I used to be able to go here and use the washroom, and now I have to go through security and whatnot. Some of the city councilors were noting that there have been significant threats raised against city councilors, and it's been behaviors that, especially towards women identified counselors, that have like led to the decision to do those things. There's still like a lot of conversation of, is that the right way to increase safety, et cetera, et cetera. But that was a pretty significant shift happening at City Hall within the last like 6 months, I think, where suddenly we had screening devices that make it harder for people to access and limits in many ways who feels comfortable even going into City Hall. And it was named that there had been like threats and such.
That's what I thought.
Thank you for the question. I'll just ask if there are any others. Okay, so now I want to move on to an example here in Ottawa, and the case study we're looking at is 1010 Somerset. This existing plan calls for 600 housing units in 4 buildings, a new French school, a daycare, an expanded recreation facility, and enhanced green space. The Dalhousie Community Association took issue with the plan's proposal to increase the number of outside parking spots from 40 to 60, especially when underground parking at the facility is planned underneath. There was a resident who successfully advocated not to have the city sell the plant recreation facility years ago, and echoed in those statements, noting it would take away from the public green space. And that's, if you can see on the image there, it's in the top right-hand side. Additionally, a 2019 study showed that Somerset Ward had the lowest tree canopy in the city at 22%. Again, as we chatted about earlier, we talk about heating and we talk about changes that have happened. Tree canopy is something that is very important. And these tree canopy is one of the things that is also covered typically in the province planning statement in terms of things that need to be facilitated and prioritized. And tree canopy, and that is often carried out. That's, this is a message. This is the policy statement is something that is at the provincial level, but it's facilitated through the cities as well as the conservations, the conservation authorities and bodies across the province. Another issue community members took issue with is that there was no retail would be located on the ground floor of the building, and of course that's not great in terms of accessibility, but in terms of the things that we need to function and to live within our communities. That being said, public meetings did lead to the revision of parkland, and it shows an example of mixed-use development, which again, mixed use meaning residential as well as commercial on the same property, a commitment to some affordable units, and then this is also a city-led development, city-led project on city land and not a developer-led application. Okay. Again, I'm not sure how familiar folks are with 1010 Somerset, but it's one that is really interesting to see. Okay. Yep, if we can just get to the next slide.
Trying to get out so we can go to dev apps because I think that's next. So just bear with me.
Yep.
I don't know how I did it last time. Here we go.
No worries. So yes, so this is DevApp. So this is the website that was mentioned as it relates to development applications. As you can see, you can search by an address if you're familiar with the address that you're looking for. You also can search by application status. So you can look at what's active, what is archived, or both active and archived. The application types. Yep. Perfect. So there are many different types, as you can see. And if you know which ward you live in, you can just look also by ward, and that might, be, easier or more identifiable, given that we all live through different parts. But again, you can see there is a number of development applications. And at this point, what's on the screen is only just the active ones. So ones that are in the past and archived are not showing up here, but these are active applications.
Right.
Perfect. Okay. Perfect. So now moving on, we're gonna have a bit of an activity for folks to do. So again, we've just gone through development applications and all the steps that are required. And in groups, we are going to read the summary of the provided real active development application. And your task is to identify considerations that you think should be factored in so that that the development addresses climate equity and or a caring city. So we will be breaking into groups, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. All right, I think everyone's with us, if I'm not mistaken. Yep, perfect. So maybe we can start off if there are any volunteers, but otherwise we can go through the groups. Again, the questions being, in terms of a climate equity lens or caring city lens, what are some things that should be considered in this development, or what are things that have been considered in your read of the development? Any volunteers?
Well, in our group,
Mhm.
we looked at the fact that we didn't see much of the tree canopy being considered in this development. And then we also noted that with the number of units, 4,500, we can imagine once there are no access to bike lanes or walk trails, then many more people would bring in their cars.
Mhm.
And we know already what that is. So that is already not reducing our emission, but actually increasing it.
Yes.
So yeah, those were the I think the two things we noted.
Yes, that's great. I'm not sure if anyone else from room 5 has any other things that are missing, or from a caring lens or climate equity lens. But I did like what you brought up in terms of the tree canopies and mature trees, and how this will be impacted again with the lack of infrastructure. There might be a push for folks to bring cars in and making it very car centric. And that also would obviously speak to emissions and our insulation and air tightness. So thank you, group 5. What about maybe group 1 or 2? Anyone from, sorry, group 2? I mean, yeah.
Group 2 included Onde and I, correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Perfect. I think we might have had some technical difficulties in our group because we were only able to converse with one other person.
Okay.
But we talked about wanting to know more about the considerations around the affordable housing mix, especially in residential areas, as well as the proximity to transit hubs and how reliable that transit is, not just the proximity, but also the reliability.
Yep.
And then access to grocery stores, other retail spaces, and like arts and culture, like recreational centers.
Yes, absolutely. I like what you brought up there, and I'm not sure if folks are familiar with the term, but retail first floor with missing services. So it's important to have a range of services, and exactly what you spoke to, where it's not sufficient to just have one or two, but there are a range of things that folks need to comfortably live in their community. And I know the other group I mentioned beforehand with the tree canopy, I also didn't want to forget to talk about efficient heating and cooling, including heating pumps, mini splits, solar, again, the whole gamut of range that what is needed to properly support the community and the development. Thank you, group 2. That was great. And maybe what about group 3 or 4?
For group 3, a couple of things we talked about. We also talked about the affordable housing mix. I don't think it was in there.
Mhm.
We first thing was just we don't find it's a very accessibly written document. I think we frankly had a hard time kind of reading through it and understanding it. But we noticed absences like affordability. We noticed absences like reference to Indigenous rights holder, in this case, the Anishinaabe. We weren't sure how how the units, like how livable they would be, if there'd be in terms of the square footage, like how much demand there is for it from people. Um, and even just like the infrastructure to getting there. It was kind of interesting, just this mention of like a potential major entertainment.
Right.
Um, and this kind of like, is there going to be one? Is there not? Like that would be a pretty big consideration that you're just leaving up a chance.
That's right.
So there's a few different things. I might be missing stuff.
No, that's great. And I like what you mentioned about like how, livable are these spaces? And that brings us to kind of questions around windows and walls and ratios to make sure things are structured in a way that are livable and that are enjoyable. So, wherever you live, you should be able to enjoy your space in a normative fashion. And sometimes the way places are developed, that's not really taken into consideration. The thought of just kind of like build up and away and just as how many spaces can we cram into one area, which is not a really healthy or productive way to develop. It doesn't sometimes consider those things. Folks enjoying the space they live in is also very important from a caring lens, but also from a climate equity lens in terms of how big are the windows, how much sun is coming, like how there's lots of different ratios. So thank you for that. Appreciate that from group 3. And then maybe last but not least, group 4. Did you have any thoughts in terms of climate equity or caring cities? What's missing or what do you think has been, articulated well? That's the group with Michelle, Nader, and Naina. Any thoughts?
Yeah,
okay. Michelle, go ahead. Go ahead.
We talked about affordable housing mix. I don't know, there was no mention of, I don't know if this is a small community, but there's no health services. Doesn't appear to be any health services.
Yep. And again, as mentioned, like that's a really important thing, whether it's, for everyday just needing access to healthcare, but there's also, you have everyday need, but then there's emergencies and whatnot. And what does that look like when you do have so many people living in a space and ensuring that folks have access? And if there's not, a suitable or enough transportation. And again, I like the fact, I don't remember which group brought it up, but it's how reliable is the transportation? Because it's one thing that, hey, transportation is nearby-ish, but if it's not reliable, then it really doesn't matter if it's 5 minutes down the road if you can't predict and don't accurately know when it's coming and how it's coming. So thank you all for that share back. That was really informative. I'm not sure if anyone else has anything to share in terms of climate equity or caring cities.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please.
Just wanted to follow up on a couple of notes. I think on the note of healthcare, that's a really important one. I believe is in the catchment area of Somerset West Community Health Center. So there are some health services, and this is a perfect example where we have kind of like our understanding of like what is zoned there and what our plans are, and like them like we might need to do a bit of advocacy work at a higher level of like, okay, making sure that the city and province are adequately funding the existing or future providers to accommodate the increased pressure on those existing services, which is something that often when we see the lived reality of these things is we factor in different things and don't necessarily see that alignment happening in other places. So that's a great point. And then on the note of the types of housing, I wanted to connect that back to some things we talked about earlier. And also I attended, it was like a full day community workshop on the future of housing in Mississippi Mills about a year ago, because they're looking at seeing a significant increase in housing as well. So they were doing this like big community outreach thing. And they had a policy expert kind of come and give the landscape of what that looked like in the province's plans. And one of the things he commented on is that years ago, when they were looking at housing, they were so focused on just the straight numbers of houses that they didn't factor in things like what size of housing do we want? So they were just looking at units. So they were like, okay, we want 1,000 new units, and so they were approving like 1 bedroom. So you have 1,000 new 1 bedrooms, but not factoring in that like most people need more space than that because they have families, for instance. So I think that is certainly something that has happened in recent history when we've looked at that decision making. And so that point that got brought up, I can't remember if it was group 3 or 2, but that notion of like what kind of housing, like certainly from that affordable lens, but also like that square footage. Are we looking at actually investing in, that's 10 blocks is quite a significant chunk of territory. Are we looking at investing in 3-bedroom homes, for instance, or 3-bedroom like units as well to allow for not just larger families, but like multi-generational families and things like that. Really looking at that mix and questioning that, I think, is a really great thing to bring into the conversation. So yeah, I just wanted to connect back some of those threads.
Yeah, no, and I think that's really a great connection. And we do have examples right across the province of when that's not considered. It's really difficult to all of a sudden, you can't really like undevelop an area, right? So these are really significant decisions that are made. And it does create issues. And I say this as I grew up in the GTA, and in Brampton, we had this, many communities that it was all single family dwelling houses and there wasn't any variety. So what ends up happening, you have a lot of traffic, at the beginning of the day and end of the day, and there's really only one way out of Brampton. And because there's not great transportation, super car centric, and it does become quite problematic from an environmental perspective, but just all overall from a livability perspective. So again, it's really difficult and that's why, it's important to get involved in the development application process to make these changes, but also to air the grievances because it's really hard to go back once things are done. I also like what Amanda mentioned about the services. So great. We may have services in place and those services are currently functioning without that development. So when a development comes and there's now so many more people, there's so many more pressures on those services. I mean, I think everyone here has probably gone to a doctor's office and waited for an obscene amount of time. What happens in terms of our services being funded and supported and to ensure that they're developed alongside. It's not just about creating units, but creating community. That will bring me to now how to get involved in the development application process. And we've sorry, Amanda.
Sorry, more ideas, a little bit more brainstorming on this part. Just to go back to the accessible transportation and the ideas around like bike lanes and trails needed and things like that as well. We can also get creative in encouraging different types of infrastructure within buildings. So for instance, when I was living in Calgary, a couple years ago now, one of the new downtown buildings intentionally was built with no parking. And what they did instead is it was designed to be like very bike friendly. So they had built into the design of the building kind of like a special path where you could kind of bring your bike up and inside, and then bike parking, like secure bike parking within the complex where you would know, and it was significantly less space than car parking, for instance. So there was a group that had talked about like the importance of like bike trails or paths or lanes and walking as well. But we can also look at advocating for that within the buildings of not only do we need to be able to do that, to have the actual paths that exist safely and that are cleared in the winter and not where they end up piling the snow. And also we can look at advocating for the developments themselves to better accommodate that because while it's great to have a bike, if you don't have somewhere to store it and you're living in an apartment, like are you just meant to bring it into your balcony if you're lucky to have one, or your front entryway? And so all of these things need to be factored in and say, okay, we want to have all this housing, and we want people to bike or to rollerblade or to scooter or what have you. What are those other pieces that go into design that help make that a smoother process for people? And those are some other ways that we can factor that in and that are going to help us, again, from that climate equity lens, reduce some of those investments in transportation and removing our reliance on cars by not only creating the infrastructure for that, but also creating the living spaces that make it more doable for us.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I also just say, it's that creative thinking, right? Where Amanda's mentioned this example in Calgary. And even if we look at just current developments, if there are going to be spaces for cars, it's important if people have EV vehicles that there's chargers built into that, right? It's something that has to be considered as we're developing. It's better to, do this as we develop as opposed to trying to do it afterwards, because not only is it exceptionally difficult and it could take a very long time. It can be very expensive. So if we can develop these things if we can make these changes as developments are ongoing and happening, it's very impactful. So when we think about, oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry, Amanda. Amanda, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
I also wanted to throw a question back out to everybody. At the very start of today's session, when we were asking people kind of like what you were introducing yourselves about, people had talked about heat waves and being concerned about that. And I'm curious if you think about this development, we had, I think it's like 5 blocks of residential, 2 blocks of parks and what have you. But if you think about the raised concerns about heat waves and the impacts that have on people, what might be some questions you have for how the development might account for that or make those more survivable for people? Do people have thoughts on what that might look like?
Thanks. William has just made a entry into the chat on the city's equity initiatives. Maybe I can jump in with one, Amanda. Maybe if there's green top, so it's important for tree canopies, but on top of buildings too, there is space for greenery and being creative and open to different approaches, right? Different as neighborhoods develop. I know there are very well-known, I would say, requirements when you are developing a neighborhood that is typically single-family dwellings. But if you are having buildings that have multi-person residences, there are different ways to do it, and some of that might be on a roof. Larger parks, typically, again, going just not to go back into too much of an example, but these things matter because places are going up and we don't always know the dimensions of who's moving into a place. So you could have somebody who perhaps has a family, maybe young children, maybe seniors, all the different ranges of people all have needs. So I think larger park spaces would be something to consider, as well as green tops on top of buildings.
Yeah, the green roofs is a really innovative one. Carol mentioned in the chat access to amenities like splash pads.
Yes.
And Carol mentioned it in the context of kids, but honestly, like any age can appreciate a splash pad when it's 40 degrees with humidity. So looking at what are those resources, but also it talks about commercial space. Is there potential for us to have a cooling site or a heating site that then can accommodate those 4,500 people when we're experiencing extreme temperatures, and asking those questions of what are we going to do when inevitably we have another one of those circumstances that is very serious for people. So looking at what are some of those other care needs that we might have, and how are we planning for that? And then looking at the housing units themselves and how are they built and designed to help offer more insulation, more natural cooling and things like this. This was something that came up in last week's session as well, of how are we making sure that not only our places are warm in the winter and it's not costing us a lot of money, but also that our places are cool in the summer. And like certainly access to air conditioning is important and can be relieved from that, but there's also building design features that can do that without then adding further pressure on our emissions. So looking at some of those really important considerations for, it's important for us to have housing, but we need to have housing that meets our needs, including square footage and rooms and such. But we also need to have housing that's built that is going to accommodate our full lived experience across 4 different seasons.
I do also want to say I love what Carol said in regards to seniors, accessible spaces for people to move around and socialize. Some people go for walks inside of malls or even their apartment buildings when it's too hot or too cold to go outside. And I think this is a very valid, thing to think about, especially as we know, you may not live up near a very large mall, and a lot of smaller malls, this is a trend right across Canada, are being demolished, and housing units are being put up. So what happens now if you don't have a mall that you could walk in, right? Like these are kind of like these third spaces, right? Where you could go and socialize, and you don't necessarily have to buy anything. But if you don't have a park, or if the park it's too hot to be outside, even community centers, ensuring that those are developed with inclusivity in mind. So whether that's a splash pad, a pool, or just the ability to be inside and have some other services as well. Okay, I'm not seeing anything else more in the chat, I don't think. I don't know if there are any hands up. Nope. Okay. So again, it's really important, as we've learned, to how to get involved in development application and the whole process. And we've noted that there are some critical times when the public can get involved. We've identified some of the points there and how you can get involved. And over the next few sessions, we'll spend more time digging around of what this might look like and how we can strengthen our skills as a community and as a group. And a key part of being successful is both knowing where to find the information and having others you are working with. So again, many hands make the work light, and that's something that we hope to continue developing through our sessions. So now I think, unless Amanda, there's anything you'd like to add? No? Okay.
It's just like open, like, do people have, we've kind of done our overview of the City Planning 101, our quick version of it. Are there any big questions people have on anything we've talked about today? I know it's late. One of our hopes was that you would have a better understanding of what that process looks like, and that you'd be a bit more familiar with development applications. And given the nature of being online and being late, we wanted to focus in on one type of development application tonight, which was on the plan for subdivision application, because it's a little bit easier for us to wrap our heads around. But there are, as Georgette shared with us earlier, different types of development applications. And we shared this one on Monday of last week when we did the first version of this workshop in person. And it's an official plan and zoning bylaw amendment in Ward 15, the Westboro area. And it's specifically to amend the Richmond Road Westboro secondary plan and zoning bylaw to facilitate the development of 3 mixed-use buildings. There's more information on it, but we didn't go over it today, but strongly encourage, if you're wanting to learn more, to get more familiar with the really technical, challenging language of development applications. We're going to share this application for you in the chat, and we'll include it in the follow-up email as well. I'm going to encourage you to check that out and ask yourself some of these similar questions. And part of the beauty of this application as a learning tool is that it just got put into the system like 2 weeks ago. It was mid-January. It's brand new. And Councillor Jeff Leeper, it's in his ward. He is hosting a virtual open house to provide an opportunity for the applicant team to share information on the proposal and to answer any questions that the community might have. And that is next Wednesday at 7 p.m. online. So we also have the Zoom information of that. So this is a really, really great and timely opportunity for you to continue to look at applications, figure it out, and then actually get to go and attend a session where you're hearing from the applicant themselves, like what are they asking for, and hearing the types of questions other people have, and also being able to ask some of your own questions that you might be sparked by to better understand what this looks like. So wanted to offer that up for those of you who have the time and capacity and are super keen to actually get to put that in practice before we come together again for session 2. I see a few hands though, so I'll stop talking and would love to hear what people have to say.
Maybe Yewande? I can see.
Oh, okay. So thank you so much. I've learned quite a bit. I didn't even know that we could make a difference, and then I've learned the different stages where we can actually make our voices heard, even though it seems there's a bit more closing in of committees to the public. I mean, with all the hyped up security around them. So maybe they will let us know how that would not deter anyone who just wants to walk in and say and voice whatever observations. But there was something during one of the inputs from, I think, group 4, I'm not sure, or 2, and it talked about relations with the First Nations, and we've not addressed that at all in all that we're saying, because I know that one of the pushbacks to the provincial, well, to the premier when he came up with fast tracking development, like what we're talking about, was the First Nations saying they were not being carried along, they were not being consulted. So how are we going to bring that in, even while we're looking at a caring climate equity neighborhood? I think it's something we need to put up front. And there was another thing I was going to bring up that we didn't talk about. Okay, so I'll just stop here.
Yeah, I think that that's a really, really important point. And as far as I know, it's not something that the city is really doing in any meaningful capacity. The National Capital Commission does have an Indigenous team, and they have meaningfully engaged with some of the nearer Algonquin communities on a few key projects recently. And so those provide some like great examples, and they've been doing the work over the last few years to build some of those relationships. I believe one of them, those projects was Kiweki Point, which is a new, I see some of you nodding your heads. So I think it's like a new kind of like lookout area. I can't remember where, somebody jump in if you know. But that was a project where they kind of like did in relation with and partnership with behind the art gallery. Perfect. Thank you, Carol. So I would look to some of the work the NCC is trying to do in the way they approach planning on those federal lands as some potential pathways forward. But as far as I know, that's not really being meaningfully considered as rights holders of the land. That said, I do believe for some of these especially kind of like city-led affordable housing initiatives, they're working in partnership with some of the Indigenous-led nonprofit housing providers, for instance, to kind of share in the visioning of those plans. But that's for very particular projects and not looking at like as rights holders. But I'll try to pull the links to the NCC information, but it's a really great point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ande?
Hi, sorry, Bree here.
Yeah.
I just had a quick question about if there's any sort of recurring language that you recommend that we look out for in planning applications that relates to climate equity that might be veiling something that we would want to be aware of, but it isn't immediately like recognizable. I guess like one example that I would notice at like the federal level is that sometimes they'll say that like there's been that it like fits within our emissions or it won't increase our emissions, but they're saying that like it's already been taken into account in current emissions, not that it won't actually create emissions. But I don't think that that's clear if you're not like in the climate policy space. So is there anything like that at the planning level?
That's a good question. I think we can take that back as feedback and maybe we can try to develop something, but I do think that's helpful as like a kind of a usable tool to like kind of like you said, use it as a almost like a bit of evaluation when you're looking. But I'm not aware of anything. I'm not sure if Amanda's aware of anything.
Yeah, I think we can have a conversation with the Ecology Ottawa team and get back to people with some guidance on that.
Yep.
Yeah, actually, we
I
were
know it's like
chatting.
informal, the stuff you might have come across. Oh, sorry, I might have just talked over someone.
No, that's okay. I was just saying that we were talking about something exactly along these lines this afternoon for either the next two workshops or the ones after that. We're trying to figure out what's the best spot to talk about it. But yeah, we'd love to we're to talk about that and yeah, planning to come up with a resource, a bit of a cheat sheet for exactly these things. So yeah, if you have any other specific suggestions for it, I would love if you would send them our way. But otherwise, would love to hear your feedback when we share it.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you so much. Tristan and Neha?
Thank you. I guess have a question to clarify my understanding of the excellent presentation you gave on the planning process, the development application process. Would you say it's fair to say that those who are submitting applications for residential or commercial real estate development typically would be the developers that are either backed or they themselves have like private capital, so that most of the applications getting put in are basically kind of investor driven land development applications? Not a lot of public capital going into developing land, or
That's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer. I'd be curious for you to go into DevApps and take a look at like maybe just focus on your neighborhood and see where they're coming from. Um, my inclination would be it's probably a mix. Certainly, there's a push for more federal and provincial resources to be unlocked through so many acronyms. CMHC, I want to say, like there's a few different, and there's the new like Build Canada Fund, I think, or like Build Canada, which is its like own new department. So there are a number of like financial levers that are being leveraged to support development, and so they are like we're seeing there's certainly many projects out there that are nonprofit developer driven
okay.
projects, for instance, that would be funded through that. Co-ops and the like are also typically financed through those types of levers, but I don't know what the actual ratio is. And I suspect that it also will look different depending on like what land is being redeveloped and for what purpose, because there's different financial incentives, I would say, for different types of projects. But I'd be really curious if you did a little digging, especially in like a particular zone, and you can kind of see, if you look at DevApps, we just shared like the summary document, but you can see all of the attached files. There's a ton of information there on the website itself, so you can get more of a sense of what that looks like.
Thank you.
I wanted to loop back on the question about like Indigenous rights holders and just make an observation. So I was trying to find on the NCC's website the information I was speaking to. I literally in the fall was on their website getting this information for a different type of workshop, and they used to have pages easily accessible about Indigenous partnerships and relations and reconciliation and like highlighting and celebrating some of those projects. Those pages don't exist anymore or are like buried. So I think that that's like a very interesting signal of shifts even in the last like 3 to 6 months of like what's being celebrated and prioritized. And I will still see if like through my old presentation some of those links are still active, even if they're not kind of easily findable through their main page. But just noting that observation that we're shifting again.
Not sure if there are any other questions. I'm not seeing any. So I would like to thank everyone for coming today. I also would like to remind folks that you're signed up for your next session. So for some folks, that means that they will be going to on February 23rd at Abbey Wynn Co-op or on March 2nd at the Rideau Community Hall. But you should have this confirmation already from once you signed up. But again, that will also be in the follow-up email as well. And it was lovely meeting everyone, and I really appreciate all the feedback and participation. Thank you so much.